Over the next several lessons, I'm going to be developing a class to keep track of dates in some detail. By sticking to one class, I can make my lectures more coherent and not quite as scattered, and you'll get a better sense of why classes are important if we look at one class in particular. Later in the exercises, we'll develop a couple of different classes than a date class. So let's start with dates, and in this particular video, we're going to talk about how data are stored in classes. So we'll begin by creating a date class. We start with the keyword class, followed by the name of the class, date, followed by an open curly brace. Let's go ahead and close the class off with the closing curly brace and semicolon. Notice that a class definition always ends with a semicolon, and you'll get an error at compile time if you try to compile a class that isn't ended with a semicolon after the closing brace. Now let's move back into the class definition. I mentioned earlier that there are two sections to a class, a private section and a public section. Let's talk a little bit more about those. Let's start with the public section. The public section is where we define any data and functions that we want to make available to any part of the program, or to another program even for that matter. The public section is defined as the interface to the class. And by the interface, I just mean whatever tools and techniques we need to make available for some code or person using our class. That's the interface. The private section is reserved for creating data and functions that are only to be used within the definition of the class, hence the name private. Private data cannot be accessed by any other part of another program or of the main program, and nor could any functions be accessed. However, they are accessible within the definition itself. Let me demonstrate how that works and why it's important. Let's start out first by creating our data in the public section of our class. So I have data values for month, day, and year, which is the three key pieces of data we need when storing a date. By doing that, I've made those three variables accessible to any part of a program. So let's go down to our main program and create a date object, D1. Now I can access the month by typing D1 dot, the dot being the dot operator, which then provides us access to the public data and functions of a class, and set a month value. For instance, D1.month equals 12. Let's say I want to go back and change that later. I can write D.month equals 123. Now, that looks wrong because we know that months only go from 1 to 12. But because month is an integer variable, and the compiler doesn't know that months of a year only are numbered from 1 to 12, it just thinks of month as being an integer value. It perfectly well accepts the 123. I could type 12,300 and the compiler would be just as happy. But clearly I'm making a mistake in terms of a date class because there is no month numbered 12,300. If instead of making our data public, we make it private, then I set it up so that only through a function can the month be accessed. That way I can write code to check to make sure that whatever is accessing my date object and setting the month only enters a valid month from 1 to 12. The compiler enforces this by not allowing access to private data. Let me show you how that works. Let's get rid of our int main code, and let's move our data declarations out of the public section and into the private section, like so. Put a space there to make it easier to read. Now let's go back and create new objects again. We'll use the same name, date D1. So we'll set the D1 object, and we'll set the month equal 12. Now when I try to compile and run this program, I get an error. The error, which you can't read, it's off your screen, says error int month is private. So you don't see an error as you type in the code. But when the compiler sees you trying to access month here, and it knows that month was declared within the private section, then there's an error. So I cannot access month in my user code. By keeping your data in a class private, you're ensuring as best as you can that the data is used correctly. And again, you can do that by writing procedures such as if statements to make sure that the data entered for a particular value is legal for that particular use. So that for a month, it's in the range of 1 to 12. For a day, it's in the range of 1 to 30, 31, or 28, depending on the month. It gets a little tricky there. And years, we can be a little bit less picky about, but we can still make sure that nobody enters like a negative number for a year, which would also be invalid. So that's why data in a class, for the most part, should be kept in the private section. There may be occasions where you want to put it in public, but for the most part, especially the key pieces of data for a class are going to be kept in the private section. In the next section, we'll talk about how to declare and instantiate class objects using class constructors.